The idea of like a kid getting interested in magic and asking a magician, how do you do this? And the magician saying, I can't reveal my secrets. And then a lifelong obsession forms. I think that's what we do here with the film. And that's why like this is kind of a film that speaks to people who are interested in that kind of thing. If you dig into the intentions of the filmmaker and the detail that's been put in and how the visual is reflecting these motifs that are embedded throughout, it starts to become a magic trick. At first glance, it seems impossible to pull off, but if you become more knowledgeable on the subject and you start to really dig into the behind the scenes and everything like that, you can figure out how it's done. And in that way, it's even more impressive. Welcome, friends, to episode 312 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And this week we discuss Christopher Nolan's 2006 film, The Prestige. What I'm going to say it, masterpiece. It's Christopher Nolan, and I remember when this film came out, I was so excited by it. I found it to be so engaging. And I only feel that more at this point. But this movie also built this like cult-like status. People have this as their favorite Christopher Nolan film in a pantheon of like unbelievable films. They have it on lists of one of the greatest movies ever made, and it did not have that fanfare when it first released. I distinctly remember the fact that this was even compared to The Illusionist. It's quite interesting with respect to Neil Burger with another thing that we covered, The Illusionist.
Yeah,
it's an enjoyable film, but this is just like a level of filmmaking not many make it to.
I agree, man. I think we talked about this on our Illusionist coverage a little bit. When those two movies came out, they came out near each other, and I remember I felt like Prestige was getting all the love, and I wanted to show love for The Illusionist. So I was one of those people who was kind of like, yeah, but what about The Illusionist? It was also really good, maybe even better. I don't know if after like studying these closely and covering the source materials and diving into them and revisiting them after all these years, I do think this is the better of those movies. And in fact, like you were talking about, it has, with this viewing, risen in my ranks of favorite Nolan films. I don't think it's my top, but I also don't know for sure what is. But it's up there. It is now like in the running. Because I think this is really a spectacular movie. And one of the things that makes it so good, I think, is how much it holds up to close analysis.
Yes.
And how much it holds up to trying to figure out every little moment and like if it's all internally consistent, and it is. And like that is the kind of thing that on my first watch, I think on your first watch, it's really hard to like fully get what this movie is, because so much of it is just you're getting caught up in the reveals. You're getting caught up in the like mind-blowing moments. And you're racing, like when the mind-blowing moment happens, like your mind is trying to figure out, how was this possible? What have I missed? What has been going on that was an illusion? And on repeat viewings, when you can let that stuff go and you can focus on what is actually happening, you can watch for the tells, and you can watch for the things that are, admittedly, most of them are in plain sight. You just don't know what to make of them once you're watching it the first time. It holds up really well to that. Like it's one of those movies that you can really like slow down and like I was pausing quite frequently while watching it this time to take notes, because I was noticing little things in every little scene. And I love films like that. Is it like perfect? I don't know. I have little quibbles, because, but you can quibble about anything. Like every great piece of art, you can find things. I do think this is a great movie. So I'm very excited to talk about it. Very different than the book, which we had a great time with. And I think a lot of those adaptation choices are fascinating, and to try and think about why they were made and how that affects the story. There's a lot of meat on the bone here.
Yeah. I am just going to go out on a limb here and say that on this viewing, with all the context of like, I've seen every Nolan film, all of them multiple times, this is probably my favorite Nolan film. Like I struggle to think of one that I enjoy more for my specific taste. Yeah. And don't get me wrong, the thing that I love about this film is the scale of it. The scope of his movies is unbelievable. Like you look at like the Dark Knight films, you look at Inception, Interstellar, you look at Dunkirk and Oppenheimer, and you're like, oh my God, like the level and the scale of these stories is so huge, and it's so like mind-blowing. And I love this story for it being way more grounded. And like there is definitely the mind-bending. There are many staples of a Christopher Nolan film that are here, like non-linear storytelling, and it's used to such great effect, and there's something really emotional that I think that Nolan taps into here that I didn't get as much from the book, which, and I think some of the changes led to this. And I don't know, I think a lot of Nolan's films get looked at these days and they say, like, you know, the emotion and like the actual like believability of some of the emotion of these characters sometimes isn't necessarily there, with obvious caveats of like there's great performances. It's just like it's not usually like the main ingredient in his films, and I think in this film he strikes a really cool balance with like the emotion of the characters and the relationships between them. Plenty of heartbreaking Nolan films, but this one like really tugs at the heartstrings for me, and it does it in such a fun, fascinating magic trick, really. Like, I mean, we talked about it in the previous coverage. This movie is set up to be The Prestige in a meta commentary. Like, it's like Nolan is this magician. He's creating the pledge, he's creating the turn, and then he's delivering on The Prestige. And the way that he plays with the audience and his understanding of how audiences are going to experience a film is so, that's where he's a master. I can't even fathom how you can look at this film and know that, like, oh, they're not going to be able to pick up on all of these details throughout and still somehow have it all be internally consistent.
It's really hard because it looks so obvious once you know.
Yes. And he keeps you on the edge of, like, the final shot in the movie is just as important as every other shot. It's not like, oh, I figured it out and, you know, the rest doesn't matter. Even when you know, like, we know what the turns are going to be. It is so satisfying when it comes to a head, and then the performances. I just love it. For my money, it's probably in my favorite. I'm not going to say it's necessarily his best film because I think that might be a different argument entirely.
Interesting. Okay, so as you're talking, I was thinking about that and Nolan and like where I'm at with it, and this movie feels a lot more akin to me to Memento and Inception, I would say, of his filmography, in the sense that they are meticulously, and maybe Tenet, which I admittedly haven't seen, in the sense that they are like meticulously constructed to where the format and like form of the movie reflects the essential character of the movie. And maybe that happens to an extent in every one of his films, but here that's like taking center stage, right? And, you know, pun intended, I guess, with the magicians. And this is like maybe I don't know, like one of the most prime examples. I think Memento is also right there, where like the structure reflects the story being told. But I do think there's something to the heart of Dunkirk and Oppenheimer, the character focus, the interpersonal dramas on display, where, and then you got his Batman films too, right? Which have a certain element of, I don't know, like epic, heroic, and just dynamic characters that are so memorable and so memorably performed. But I mean, ultimately, this isn't a question of like what the best Nolan film is, but just for me, like I'm categorizing this more in that grouping, I guess, if I'm grouping up the Nolan films. And among that group, I would have said for a long time, I think Inception was the best. But like, man, I honestly, this is like kind of my favorite mode of his storytelling. I love this stuff. They're all good. Again, I haven't seen Tenet. I know a lot of people have criticisms of that movie, but Memento is so good, but feels like a kind of an early movie that was like limited in its scope in a way that this doesn't. So yeah, this elevated, like I said, it is definitely near the top for me now. Really enjoyed this thing. I think it's also fascinating how it works so well as a story about these two men's obsessions and the things it drives them to do, the sort of horrible pathways it leads them down, the destructive elements of this, and their competitiveness and their vanity. It works as a deeply human story that you can apply to a lot of areas in life. It also works as this whole meta commentary on filmmaking, which
I go in for. That's the thing for me. Yeah.
And it does it without ever like mentioning movies. Like, it doesn't ever talk about movies. It completely keeps it in the realm it's focused on. And yet you, like, especially on repeat viewings, I was definitely thinking about how much of this is a commentary on what it's like to make a movie.
Absolutely. And storytelling in general, but ultimately, like, the sleight of hand.
Yeah.
The way that you dole something out to an audience, the way that...
What is shown, what is a distraction?
Yes, exactly. And in this movie, specifically, the editing is used in a way that really reflects what you can only do in film. I think
Yeah.
that the way that he's cutting around, obviously I've already mentioned the nonlinear nature, but the way that he's doing it and the way that the scenes in conjunction are, there's another meaning to them. And there's like sort of there's a misdirect going on because you're like, wait, where is this within the narrative? Where does this fall? And man, that makes for such a satisfying reveal at the end when you can kind of then think of it chronologically.
Yeah, it's so nested too. Like there's so many layers to the story that keep getting peeled back. And like I think one of my criticisms that I would go ahead and pull out is just that it is a tough movie for your first watch. It's just a different experience. Like I remember the first time watching this being at least like slightly confused to like moderately confused throughout the entire movie, basically, about like when are we, what's the sequence of events, you know, why are we seeing what we're seeing now, who's this voiceover, at what point is this voiceover occurring versus this other voiceover occurring, okay, we keep cutting to this other scene, is this occurring after that, like, and there's
Yeah.
so much of that you're trying to keep up with that it becomes very difficult to even follow the plot.
Yeah, and he does do a lot to like visually kind of seat you. It's like if it's like a cooler shot, it might be from the prison or it might be from a past. If it's like a warmer shot, and like typically he uses there's diaries that each of them are
Yeah.
using throughout. He uses those so you can kind of place yourself. But I agree with you. I do think that it could be difficult to really grasp on and hold on through the whole story with everything else that's going on.
And let me be clear, that's not necessarily like a criticism of it as a piece of art. Like I don't think every piece of art needs to be easily digestible upon first viewing.
Yeah.
Like I'm not going to say that. I just think that your first time viewing is going to be very different than your second and third time, right? Like it just will be, and just not everybody's into that. Not everybody wants that. A lot of people just want to see a movie once and feel like they've had the, you know, full experience with nothing left on the plate. And that's not going to be this movie for me, or for I think most people.
We talk about attention to detail and storytelling in general and in books and films. This is that kind of film where it's like it's an unfathomable amount of attention to detail that goes into it and meticulous setting up of every single domino so that it all falls perfectly. And like it's just it blows my mind when I start thinking about some of this stuff. And in getting into that, to talk about some of how the prestige, the magic is similar. It's like someone, we talked about it last week some. The idea of like a kid getting interested in magic and asking a magician, how do you do this? And the magician saying, you know, I can't reveal my secrets. And then a lifelong obsession forms and they dig into it and they dig into it. And I think that's what we do here with the film. And that's why like this is kind of a film that speaks to people who are interested in that kind of thing. If you dig into the intentions of the filmmaker and the detail that's been put in and how the visual is reflecting these motifs that are embedded throughout, it starts to become a magic trick. At first glance, it seems impossible to pull off, but if you become more knowledgeable on the subject and you start to really dig into the behind the scenes and everything like that, you can figure out how it's done. And in that way, it's even more impressive when
Yeah.
you know how it's done than just the initial sort of reveal.
I do think this movie asks a lot of the audience in what they're willing to believe and buy in on, and not because like there's an element of like they show it to you, to be true. So in the text of the movie, it's true, but you have to square that with your own sense of reality and whether or not you can buy in to the ideas being shown to you as true and whether or not you think this could actually be real. Because I think one of the benefits of this movie is it feels so real. Like he does such a great job of like bringing this historical, you know, time period to life. And it feels so gritty and the characters feel so recognizably human that we're seated in a place of reality. And so there are times when it presses up against that, and the movie's telling us what it's showing us is still within this gritty reality. But personally, there were times where I was having a little bit of trouble with that because it felt like it was almost like breaking up a pact we had formed with just the style of movie I thought I was watching. That affected me more the first time. Having read the book and knowing certain things going in, I was able to get past that in a way that I think previously I was docking points from this film for. So it's like weird because like now I'm at this new place with it, But I don't think that that former place was invalid. And there might be people listening to this or watching this who might feel that still. And I do want to validate that because I think that's a completely valid reading of this.
Yeah.
If there are certain things about it that just were to you, you're like, that's too much. I can't buy that. I think that's a reasonable reaction to have to this movie too.
Sure. Yeah.
There is an element of like cleverness too that I think might rub people the wrong way. I don't know. I tend to like it, but there's an element of like, is this movie like too clever? Like it's like really going for it. It's like it's the extreme of like the haha. You watch this again and it'll be completely different now, and it's like, all right, dude. You know, like there's an element of that going on too, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. I can see that.
But I like it, so ultimately I don't care. I don't know. I feel like I end up playing devil's advocate a lot, but just trying to anticipate the different kind of reactions there are to this movie. But it's like, all that being said, I love this movie. so I'm ready to be more effusive with my praise going forward.
Before we go any further, we're going to talk Nolan. We're going to talk some of the production, how this came about. But I do know that we have some housekeeping stuff we wanted to get out of the way.
Yeah, so just real quick, May 26th is a date you're going to want to pay attention to if you want to suggest a project for us to cover. That's the date in which we are going to go on our Patreon master suggestion list, and see what projects have the most likes. Of those, we'll form a Patreon dedicated poll. But if you listening to this would like to comment a suggestion and have a chance at it being one of the ones that we're going to cover, that's where you're going to want to go. It'll be the top link in the show notes.
I think we're about
Click
to
on
hit
that
7,
by
right?
by the 26th, which I think is going to be Sunday of the week this comes out. You're going to want to get that suggestion in. Also, for everybody else, some potentially big news. We've been doing this podcast for the last 7 years in the same way, and that's trying to release an episode every single week. We are going to make a slight adjustment to that because we are also releasing our Patreon bonus content once per month. What we're going to do now is move it so that we are still releasing an episode every 3 weeks, but then we're going to have that one extra week per month dedicated to that Patreon episode. And our hope is that that will improve the quality overall of everything we're putting out, because we won't be as slammed on one of those weeks where we're trying to do two things at once. So just what you need to know is that 1 week every so often, we won't be releasing anything, and that'll be a great time to catch up on our 300 plus episodes we have in the past. And we hope that everybody's going to be cool with that and understand as we transition to a slightly different release schedule.
Well, and it's also a great opportunity to check out our Patreon, patreon.com/ink2film, if you don't mind
Absolutely.
me plugging it. Because like he said, we're going to be releasing an episode that week. It's not that we're not posting anything. It's that it's just going to be on our Patreon. And we do a lot of fun stuff over there. We have like adaptation adjacent stuff. We've done like video game adaptations, and we tend to experiment there. And I think it's a place where we can be a little more
Sequels and
casual.
prequels and other things that we don't normally get into, in the main feed.
Yeah, we have a lot of fun there. So it's definitely worth checking out, and you can support for as little as $2 a month to get those bonus episodes.
But all right, man, let's get into this actual movie. There's so much to talk about. We're going to get into all the spoilers. Yeah, be aware that those are coming.
Yeah, so I want to talk about the production and the development of this, but first, just to talk generally, we have covered Christopher Nolan before. We covered him with Memento on this podcast, which was based on a short story, I believe, written by his brother, Jonathan Nolan, who then comes
Great
back
movie.
to help write on this film, on The Prestige. So Jonathan and Christopher Nolan both wrote this screenplay together, which it's always cool to see them collaborating like that. You have to think about like how close the bond of a brother is in like a working relationship like this, like an artistic duo. Like that's pretty impressive stuff. And we just talked, speaking of Patreon, just talked about Jonathan Nolan being involved in the first 3 episodes of the Fallout TV series that came out on Amazon.
Is one of them kind of like a Fallon here?
I really was thinking about that a lot. I'm like, how can you not like kind of think about that and address it and be like, I think that they feel that they sacrifice a lot for their art. I don't think that they go to Borden's level of living the same life. There's not, one singular Christopher Jonathan Nolan.
Yeah, I mean, they're as a writing duo, at the very least, producing this story. There's probably a lot of back and forth. Hard to know who is present for what thing, who originated what idea. I've definitely heard that is often the case. So I think there are some parallels there, and at least sort of sharing of creative vision with somebody else that closely.
Yeah, it reminds me of Good Omens a little bit with like Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, where they were like kind of writing it in conjunction in different chapters, and it all becomes one work that they both worked on and both get the credit. So Christopher Priest was approached about an adaptation of his novel, The Prestige. He was impressed with Nolan's films Following and Memento, and subsequently producer Valerie Dean brought the book to Nolan's attention. In October 2000, Nolan traveled to the United Kingdom to publicize Memento. While there, Nolan read Priest's book and shared the story with his brother while walking around in Highgate, which is the location later featured in the scene where Angier ransoms Borden's stage engineer in Highgate Cemetery. So they ended up the place where they kind of
The cemetery. Okay, interesting.
the place where they started talking about producing this and creating it. They actually brought into the film, which I think is very
That's
cool.
cool.
The development process for The Prestige began as a reversal of their earlier collaboration. Jonathan Nolan had pitched his initial story for Memento to his brother during a road trip. So this time Christopher's bringing this to Jonathan's attention. In late 2001, Nolan became busy with the post-production of Insomnia and asked his brother Jonathan to help work on the script. So he gets brought into the sort of writing fold. And the process of collaboration between them occurred intermittently over the next 5 years. In the script, the Nolans emphasized the magic of the story through the dramatic narrative, playing down the visual depiction of stage magic. The 3-act screenplay was deliberately structured around the 3 elements of the film's illusion: the pledge, the turn, and the prestige. Quote, "It took a long time to figure out how to achieve cinematic versions of the very literary devices that drive the intrigue of the story," Christopher Nolan told Variety. "The shifting points of view, the idea of journals within journals and stories within stories, finding the cinematic equivalents of those literary devices was very complex." So that was always fascinating to me. That from the get-go, the idea of the 3 stages of the trick then being folded into the screenplay. In 2006, I thought that was just the most ingenious thing I'd ever heard, because it, like, we've talked about it a little bit being a meta commentary on film, but that wasn't something that I got on the first viewing. I sort of understood the narrative of what happened, and then on repeat viewings, it sort of starts to become clear that it's being played out before you by the magicians who are the filmmakers in this case. Just absolutely mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah, and that is still even just like one element of it, and like that in and of itself would be impressive. But then you referenced something else there that is like a major element to how this story plays out, and that's journals within journals. We are experiencing Borden reading Angier's journal, and in Angier's journal, Angier is reading Borden's journal that he's gotten at some point earlier that as of yet we don't know when he got it. So the man who's ultimately at the top of this order of POV is the person whose journal Angier is reading. So that in and of itself is such a complex dynamic to set up. It allows for voiceover. So we get actually a pretty large amount of voiceover. Memento also has a lot of voiceover. So it's interesting that there's a lot of this early on here in Nolan's career. But you're able to get away with it because these are journals, right? And so you're reading the words themselves, but then you're also getting Angier thinking about what he's reading because he is in turn writing his own journal, which is now being read by Borden. And then, of course, as the course of these movie plays out, we're going to find out that each of the time that one journal is being read by the other, the person who left that journal to them is aware that they are going to be reading it and is manipulating what they're saying. Yeah. So all of that, like that in and of itself would be an incredibly complex movie to make, right? And then you're also trying to do this whole 3-part reveal on top of that. And that just shows the layers of complexity that exist in this movie, that when you start unpeeling all of that and like thinking about how they had to put that together, it's honestly mind-blowing that it is able to work and that that they pulled it off. It's pretty incredible.
Well, and to be brave enough and to be confident enough to say the audience can figure this out and they will go along with it. Because that is a lot, like you've said before, to ask of an audience. Yeah. And realistically, like there are moments at the end of the film where they have to show you like the reveal, because if they didn't have those moments, those flashes of like specific things happening, you could definitely be forgiven for having missed some certain details. They have to literally do like 4 or 5 reveals in a row there at the end. They're like bang, bang, bang. These are all the moments where these things were different than you thought. And this was this sort of sleight of hand being shown in slow motion so we could see what happened.
And I think there were so many reveals, it becomes a little bit overwhelming. And I remember walking out of the theater and people like, there was definitely a sense of like, that was so much at the end. Like I was still sort of like reacting to how mind-blowing this other reveal was. And then I got hit with this other reveal and I got hit with this other reveal. And like, I think people didn't even really know what to make of it. And like, there's a sense of like, you can overwhelm an audience. And I think that might sort of play into why some of the initial reaction to this was a little more muted. And then maybe over time it's grown because people have had a chance to revisit it and fully appreciate everything that's happening.
Yeah, I would say that it was critically well received at the time as well,
Yeah.
and I think like generally audiences liked it, and it made its
No,
money
it
back,
was
and
definitely
yeah,
positive.
it was successful and positive, but it's the sort of magnitude and the level of which it's risen to at this point,
Yeah. And like
wasn't
you said,
there.
it's kind of like, yeah, if you talk to people about what their favorite Nolan film is, I would definitely say The Prestige is going to come up a lot. It's a prime contender because it's like kind of a deeper cut without being like The Following or something. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like honestly, and it's a good choice. I can't fault anyone for picking this one, and it's up there now for me. So
So just some fun stuff that I saw in my research. Jonathan Nolan made a pilgrimage to Colorado Springs to like go out of his way, research Nikola Tesla, and like he based the electric bulb scene that I'm sure you know just by me saying that what scene it is.
yeah.
He based that on an actual experiments conducted by Tesla.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that scene is, I think, one of the more memorable as far as like visuals go. Visually, like all those bulbs lighting up in that big field. I know it was in the trailer. I remember.
Yeah.
Like that was definitely one of those cool, like, oh wow, this is a different kind of movie. It's not something I'm seeing every day.
So apparently that was shot in like a parking lot of Mount Wilson Observatory. So they just dressed it up and made it look great, which brings again sort of Christopher Nolan's style of shooting and his intentionality and his push for authenticity, right? So we know Nolan, he's been developing this reputation for himself over the course of his career. This is earlier on to where you could argue that he doesn't have Oppenheimer sway at this point. But you know, he's very interested in continuing to champion film, like shooting on film,
Yeah.
celluloid rather than shooting digital. And he likes to shoot in practical locations, and you can see this back as far as The Prestige and movies even before that, where there's only one or two scenes that they created in sound stages, which I think was like the underside of the stage. When anytime anybody's like underneath the stage, I believe they built
Oh,
that.
okay. Yeah, yeah.
But most of the other stuff was at practical locations that they dressed to look period accurate. And that's just like that, again, attention to detail, level of production that I think always has like a sort of magic to it, for lack of a better term.
It shows up, you know. I think the distinction might be subtle, but it's there when people do that. I think it makes it for the better.
I want to give credit again to Priest for writing Tesla into this story, because
Yeah,
it's such a fucking cool element to this story. And then
yeah,
what
it's cool.
Nolan does it, and the way that like David Bowie's Tesla comes in, and like just his impact on the film.
I liked that Tesla and Edison having their own little rivalry going on. This is something that's alluded to in the book, but I think it was played up a little more in the movie. I did appreciate more how that is such a parallel to our two leads here and their own rivalry, as if like, you know, these other two men are also just in a bitter rivalry where they're like sabotaging each other, and it's like dictating the course of like human history and discovery.
Absolutely, especially in this century. Probably one of the more famous versions of that story is their feud, these two titans of industry, and obviously we know like how that kind of fell. And there's the stories that go on about, you know, Tesla and Edison, and their like how far they took it. Seems like definitely a parallel to how far these men take their feud. And just in talking about David Bowie, one of my favorite people who ever walked the earth. Genuinely, like his music, just everything about the man. Always been a massive fan. Casting him in this role is so cool. He brings such a gravity to
Yeah.
the film.
And they really build up that reveal too, and like he's the perfect kind of person to be playing the role to where it feels like it lands. Because like it's like 50 minutes into the movie, and yet the whole time we've been talking about Tesla. It's been building up the meeting of Tesla.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it lands.
Bowie's an alien who came to Earth, and like he, like I said, like he, as soon as he walks on frame, you're like, oh my God, David Bowie's in this film. I've read that Nolan wanted someone who was not necessarily a film star, but was extraordinarily charismatic.
Yeah.
Nolan stated that Bowie, quote, was really the only guy I had in mind to play Tesla because his function in the story is a small but very important role. Nolan contacted Bowie, who initially turned down the part. A lifelong fan, Nolan flew out to New York to pitch the role to Bowie in person, telling him no one else could play the part. Bowie accepted after a few minutes.
Wow. There you go.
It's just the kind of like film history stuff that I love that.
Cool.
That's so cool. And in talking about the cast in general, like you got Hugh Jackman, Christian Bale, Michael Caine, Scarlett Johansson, stories about all of these. But Nolan stated Angier has a wonderful understanding of the interaction between a performer and a live audience, a quality he believed Jackman possessed. And it's cool because I think Hugh Jackman has walked this fun line of like Wolverine clearly, but also like he's a theater guy. He likes to act in plays. He likes to be involved in musicals, and it's been cool to see that throughout his career. And for Nolan to pick up on that and see him, it's just a great casting choice here. And then of course Christian Bale as the other side to it. He had worked with him on Batman Begins in 2005, but he didn't even consider Bale for the role until Bale contacted him. Nolan subsequently believed that Bale was, quote, exactly right for the part, and that it was unthinkable for anyone else to play it. So yeah, it's just very cool to see both of these people. I mean, these are like, especially in 2006, these are two of the people that like have massive followings in like these superhero communities, Wolverine and Batman. And then you fold that into this much more grounded story and a chance for both of these people to show their range. Excellent performances from both of them.
And it was really just getting started too. If you think about that time period, right? These guys were just going to get even bigger.
Yeah.
Because really, The Dark Knight, like that was going to really take off Nolan's Batman franchise, and that wasn't even out yet. Bale, of course, had big movies. Like we talked about American Psycho early on as one of his breakout roles. And he's a really dynamic and interesting performer, always has been.
Yeah.
And I think he's great here. I do think Hugh Jackman has that showy performance, like theater kid energy to him that really sells that, like, he is just better at that. His showmanship is better, and I think that totally makes sense that we see it play out that way. But like Bale is the one who's got the sacrifice and the commitment, and I think there's just some reflections in like these guys' real lives. And so that's so fun that you're able to do that with your casting. Hats off to it. And then these guys, in Scarlett Johansson, like freaking Andy Serkis, like there's huge stars that are all like transitioning into becoming what they're going to be, and this is just such a cool moment in time where you could get a cast like this and not have it be Avengers Endgame. You know what I mean? Because like some of these people are so freaking huge now, but you're able to get it all together. Of course, Nolan can still command that kind of cast now, but it's because he is more well known. Whereas this is a point in his career where he was respected, but not what he is now, right?
Correct. Yeah. I just wanted to note too with Bale, like he has that danger to him. Like he is a loose cannon. Like you can tell, and he brings that to the performance. It's so different than the collaboration that he had with him on Batman in a lot of ways. And then moving into the rest of the cast, like Michael Caine is like acting royalty, and I'm sure,
and he's great. He's kind of the heart of this movie in many ways. Even as he like seems to side with Angier when in a time in which I wasn't sure that I wanted to side with Angier, but like talking about Bale's performance, like it is, I think at first I didn't know what to make of it because it's so kind of scattered, and like I didn't realize that like the fact that he feels like different people sometimes was the purpose, you know what I mean? Because like you don't know that, so it was kind of a disjointed performance when you're first watching it. You're like, this guy, I thought I was kind of understanding him to be this like family guy who's like deeply in love with his wife, and like the next scene he would be behaving completely differently and treating her way differently, and you're like, what's going on? And it's again, that's why repeat viewings are going to add so much more to it, because you can start to understand that, like, when you talk to it as we get to the plot, like I'm pretty sure I was able to track which version of Borden is in what scene throughout the entire movie. And that's pretty amazing that you're able to do that, because they could have easily just said like, oh, it could be either one, wink wink, but like there's enough in there to where you can start to piece it together.
Absolutely.
And it tells a coherent story in the background of like everything else that's going on.
Yeah. And there's a character that's introduced that's like a double for Angier as well. So it's so cool to like approach these two actors, Hugh Jackman, Christian Bale, and like to get to deliver this script to them and say like, you guys get to play multiple versions of the character, basically, like Angier, obviously, and then there's like the other the double, and then Christian Bale getting to play two characters, and like you said, the subtlety of that and the understanding of where you are within the movie.
Root or something.
I think it is Root.
Yeah. Honestly, like the actors were probably drawn to that, and I do think there was a little element of like, you get to do this too, Hugh Jackman. I will say, one of my slight quibbles is I kind of wish they had actually used a double and not had Hugh Jackman play his own double, because it's too good. Like he looked like it. I think the whole purpose of it being a double and not a twin and not a brother, right? It being a double, I think the whole point is that that's not good enough, right? Like if you look closely enough, you can tell the difference. Like only at a distance is this going to work. Like there's all these pitfalls to using a double, and yet like I'm looking at the guy and I'm like, that's Hugh Jackman. You know what I mean? Like they did a little bit to try and make him seem kind of different, but like that's the kind of stuff is like every now and then I have like a little quibble, and that's one of them where I was like, I kind of wish they had just cast somebody. Look, now does that person exist? I don't know, and that's one of the problems you're going to run into, and you got to find somebody who looks good enough. So it's probably a very difficult casting situation, but I just wonder if at any point that was a discussion they had about like, are we going to actually use a double here versus have Hugh Jackman play this double?
To be honest, it's not something I really had an issue with. Like I feel like he was able to play it enough to where like I bought into the fact that this is another character. Of course, I can see the meta situation going on where it's Hugh Jackman twice, but I thought he did a good job. The personality is very different. The physicality. He did
a good job.
Yeah.
Like, don't get me wrong. It's not an element of like I think anybody would have suffered this criticism. I just think personally the point of a double not being as good as what Borden is able to do with having a twin brother is lost a little bit when you can just go find a random double in a bar who looks exactly like you. And they play it out in other ways with the power dynamic and the lack of trust and like all of that. So like I get it's not like a huge criticism. Again, it's a quibble. It's just like I don't know. It always felt kind of weird. It felt like it undercut a little bit of the twin narrative when essentially Hugh Jackman also has a twin in the movie.
Yeah. There's a lot of things about this that there's so much going on with doubles as well, right? Like to have another double, it's just another layer of that. Like we get, the Canaries, we get the board and stuff. We get this stuff here with Angier. And then how that obviously manifests itself throughout the rest of the movie. We continue to see like duplicates and copies and things like that to be really relevant. Last person I do want to just touch on is Andy Serkis got to basically just hang out with David Bowie like all the time. And he said that he was a huge fan and it was super enjoyable to work with him, saying that Bowie was very unassuming, very down to earth, very at ease with himself and funny. So just jealous.
This would have been coming
Andy
off
Serkis.
the heels of Lord of the Rings, right? Around this era. So like
years,
like I remember being like, that's Gollum, and like it was like one of the first times I had seen him, to my knowledge, in like a live role, right, where he wasn't mocapping something, and being excited about that. And of course now we've seen that a bunch, and like he's a great actor just in general.
He is a great actor. He's also going to direct a Lord of the Rings film. So here we go.
We'll see how that goes.
We will. All right, so moving into the plot here. In 1890s London, Robert Angier and Alfred Borden work as shills for a magician under the mentorship of John Cutter, an engineer who designs stage magic. During a water tank trick, Angier's wife Julia fails to escape and drowns. Angier, devastated, accuses Borden of causing her death. The two become bitter enemies and part ways. Borden begins a solo act, while Cutter helps Angier launch his own career. In retaliation for his wife's death, Angier sabotages Borden's bullet catch trick and shoots off two of the latter's fingers. Borden, in turn, sabotages a performance of Angier's, and later develops a trick he calls the Transported Man, in which he appears to travel instantly between two wardrobes on opposite ends of the stage. Unable to discern Borden's methods, Angier hires a double, Gerald Root, to perform his own version of the trick. The imitation is a greater success, but Angier is dissatisfied as he ends the trick hidden under the stage, while Root basks in the applause. Borden then approaches Root and explains that he has high leveraging power over Angier, causing him to act more and more arrogant. In return, Angier has his assistant, Olivia, spy on Borden to learn how he performs the Transported Man. However, Olivia falls in love with Borden and becomes his assistant. With her help, Borden sabotages Angier's act. Confronted by Angier, Olivia gives him a copy of Borden's encoded diary. Angier acquires the keyword to decode it, Tesla, by threatening to kill Borden's stage engineer, Fallon.
Yeah, so, this covers a lot of ground in this movie. I think we just kind of hop around, talk about scenes and moments that we want to touch on. One that really stood out to me early on is when this young boy is watching the performance of that older magician and recognizes the reality of one of the birds being killed. And he says, "Oh no, here, Borden's there," and he says, "Here's the bird back, good as new." And he says, "But where's his brother?" And of course, it's like a moment of him seeing through the trick, but it's also directly talking about what's going on with Borden. Where's his brother, right?
Yep.
It's such a powerful moment, especially on repeat views, where like he's really touched onto something there. And again, it's this movie operating in plain sight, even if you don't know what you're seeing.
Yeah, and the idea of someone sort of sussing through the trick makes you think about how people approach, and we talked about this a little bit last week too, how people approach movies, stories, magic tricks. They want to figure it out. Like they're like, I'm gonna figure this out. I'm gonna look
Some
at
do,
a very
and some want to be duped.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Many do want to be duped, but some do want to know how the trick is performed, and I think it brings to light the idea of like the type of people, and again, this is always likening it to film is just like my natural reaction, but like trying to figure out how the trick is performed and that digging that goes on, and yeah, the way that maybe these men are just they're just the boy who is able to suss out something being different and how that continues forward.
I also like some of the smart changes here to the story, and it's not necessarily that what is changed is better, because like I liked what happened in the book, but there are changes made to tell the story that Nolan wants to tell. And I really liked the idea of having them work for the same magician together.
Yes.
And then the whole accident that occurs where Angier's wife drowns. It's a really interesting moment. It also establishes the tone of this movie as being very dark, because this is like someone drowns early on in this movie. And I absolutely loved, and I remember being like, I just feel differently now about this whole, like, I can't remember what knot I tied, right, on Borden's part. And I think it's quite clear that the movie is telling us that the other knot was tied.
Yes.
But he says, I keep asking myself that. And I love that phrase, because it sounds like he's talking about like just the inner turmoil that he's having, but he's actually saying, I'm asking my brother, and he won't tell me. He can't remember. He says he doesn't remember. So I think that version of Borden, like, I don't know how we want to call this, like Borden 1 or 2, like what do we want to call him?
Well, I think
Borden,
you identify them by the woman that they're in love with.
Right. Borden, who I think eventually falls in love with Olivia, I think is Borden. I'm going to call him Borden 2. Borden 1 is the one who is in love with Sarah. We'll call it that.
Yeah.
His wife, yeah. So I think Borden 2 is the one who does the whole knot thing. I think he's the one who won't admit it later. And I think he's the one who becomes slightly more obsessed with this competition with Angier throughout. I think they both are, but a little more is Borden 2. He's the one also that Borden 1, who's with the wife, tells him, you just got to let it go later. And I think he doesn't listen. So like, I think you can track that there are these two Bordens. They're both switching off who's Fallon and who's not. Yeah, I love some of the ways that they deal with that when they're talking about it, and the whole conceit around the do you love me? And you know, he says, oh, I love you, and she says, I believe you today. And it just seems kind of like an interesting moment between these two people, and you're like, oh yeah, some days it does feel like you don't love people, and she's picking up on that.
You just
and
think
it's like,
he's
no,
erratic.
she can just tell when it's him, when it's the one who genuinely does love her, and when it's the other one who doesn't. Because essentially, and this is unlike the book, they are distinct people here who one of them is in love with Sarah and one of them isn't. At least not in the same way, right? One of them is in love with Olivia and one of them isn't. And they perform and they act and they try and do what they can to keep up appearances. But I love that she can see through it, like, because that just makes sense to me that in real life someone would, to some extent, right? It would be nearly impossible. This is one of those things where you have to suspend a level of disbelief to buy into. But again, like, that's the whole point of the movie. It's asking you to do that with this insane sacrifice that these two guys are making. Yeah, and just the fact that, like, Fallon, what a awesome level of makeup to where he looks a little weird. And you can kind of tell something's going on with him. And we never get, like, too many close-up views of him, although we do get a few. Mm-hmm. And the idea that they were so confident that they could put enough makeup on Christian Bale to where we wouldn't be able to tell that it's actually him is pretty incredible. And even knowing that it is him, There was only a couple times where I felt like I could see through the makeup and see that it was Bale,
Yep.
because of just how good that makeup was.
Well, and very strategic shot selection, like you said. Like he
Yeah.
walks through frames, he's in motion. He, you know, the way that and like you get better looks at him as the movie goes on. Earlier
You do
on,
often see Fallon's back, but yeah, you're right. There are certain moments where you get like close-ups of his face. Every now and then, there's like, I feel like they shied away from showing the eyes too much because I think they realized that that was one of the times where you could see Bale, is if you like looked him right in the eyes.
yeah.
But like it's amazing that they were able to pull it off as much as they did.
I talked about the emotion of this film and how I felt it was changed from the book, and you're touching on some of it with like the idea that they were kind of like, you know, coworkers, and
Yeah,
then
friends,
this
yeah.
and the guilt that Borden may carry from having tied the incorrect knot, being so like confident in himself and just being overconfident and saying, oh, yeah, she's going to get out of it, and she says
Remember,
that she'll get out of it.
two different people in Borden, and one of them did this mistake, and the other one is paying for it
Living
as well.
and that continues to be the case. Like the one of them makes a decision and the other one has to go along with it to make the story straight and have it to continue. Such as Borden got married to Sarah, then the other one had to have okayed it, and like that's
Yeah.
a situation that they've had to navigate up to the
There's
point
so many
of the
good little
start of this
moments too
film.
with that,
Yeah.
where like they're talking about getting the house, and she's like, "Oh, I thought you said we couldn't afford it," and he's like, "Well, I changed my mind," you know. And it's like, it's because you were talking to different versions of me, and one of them clearly this was a disagreement they had about whether or not they could afford it. So funny. But there's also another big change here from the book that we should highlight in case people didn't listen to our book episode. In the book, Borden causes a miscarriage, but not Angier's wife dying. So it's still a really serious and severe, but he isn't aware of it. Is I think also key. Borden in the book doesn't know really why Angier is so mad at him, and thinks that it's more petty. And so a lot of the sort of rivalry grows of like, I can't believe this guy's so petty and so mad at me. And like now we're just gonna have this rivalry where it's like here it's like, no, Borden knows why Angier hates him. Like he has to know. Like, you know, he the accident resulted in his wife's death. Which, by the way, we gotta level at least like, I want to say 50% of the blame should fall on Cutter's feet, in my opinion.
Gotta smash that case faster.
Dude, you are there as a safety. You've got the timer, you've got the axe. How have you not tested this to see if it actually works? What is this level of safety protocol? Come on.
Yeah.
You can't have a safety protocol that doesn't work when the time comes that is necessary. Pretty scary thing though, I did look up because I was curious. CPR, as we accept it as like modern CPR, didn't really come about until the 1950s. There was chest compressions and stuff going on as early as like the 1890s, but it is very believable that in this situation, when she comes out of the tank, they would have no idea what to do to try and get her back. And like, I kept thinking like she probably could have lived if they've just performed CPR on her,
Yeah.
because she wasn't really in there that long, from what we saw at least. So that's an even darker kind of twist on it, and that's true for a lot of people over the years who before CPR died, who if someone had just performed CPR, they probably would have lived.
Yeah. Another emotional through line that gets more emphasis in the film is Borden with his family. Like we understand that he's married and has a child, and that's something that he navigates in the book with his other self. But here, it's like kind of the through line for Borden, and like you can understand like the guilt and the trauma that he possibly, especially the one who's in love with Sarah, his wife, feels over what happened with Angier's wife. Because he has that family, and that's the only thing that's important to him in the world, clearly. And the other Borden too, I guess. He doesn't. That's not what is important to him. The magic is what's important to him. So you know, in navigating that, and then showing like Borden 1 and his attachment to his daughter and his wife, and he clearly loves her, and that
he's
all
the
of
family
that,
man. He's family man Borden. Yeah.
all of that added so many layers, I felt, and really extrapolated out on the
Yeah,
characterization.
because at first, when you first watch the movie, they're the same person, and like you don't make that distinction. And it's only upon these repeat viewings where you're going, okay, which one is this? Because I didn't realize that it was consistent in that way to where you could actually pick out a distinction in their behavior and how they treat those around them, and like when each one is swapping in. I think there are a lot of clues in there for us to follow along. I'm not sure you can 100% know in every scene, especially early on some of them, but like you know in most of them, I think, if you look back.
And so in that way, just exploring more of the emotion of the characters, I think was a really smart change on the Nolan's part because it really drew me in, and I'm always there for the characters, right? The characters and their interactions tend to be the thing that sticks with me, and yeah, this
Oh man,
version just
and I
really
keep touching
does.
on this Fallon reveal because ultimately it's one of the most mind blowing. But like, I love how this is set up in so many ways. There's another moment where Borden finds out that he's going to be a father and that they're going to have a baby, and the very first thing she tells him, and he says, "We should have told Fallon immediately." First thing he says, because Fallon has just left, and then he says to her, "We're having a baby." And it sounds like he's saying like me and you, but I think he's actually talking about him and Fallon.
Yeah.
And like it's such a cool moment because I think this is actually not the one who loves the wife who's being told this. And so he's like, oh shit, we should have told Fallon because he's the one who really would be happy to hear this.
Right.
It's just such a good moment.
So good. And then it makes me think like in a lot of ways, like why not have Borden one, who is the one who's married and in love with Sarah, why not have him 99% of the time be the one who's like around her and hanging out with her? Like why even swap out and have the other one go out and do stuff?
It's a good question. I think honestly it's part of the illusion, and the whole thing that they've committed to is the idea that while one is Borden, the other has to be Fallon. And Fallon has to be someone who doesn't really do anything. He's the engineer or whatever they call it, where you're like basically like a stage engineer and you work behind the scenes, but you don't really have much of a life. And so I think the trade-off is half the time one of us gets to be the version of ourselves that has a life.
Gets to relax.
And so it's not fair for for the one, because I have the family, be like, it always gets to be me and you have to be Fallon all the time.
That makes sense.
So of course they're going to swap, but it's one of those situations where it's like in real life, would anybody agree to this? Would they like actually follow it and not break character? No, but the whole point of the movie is that like if anybody was going to do it, it would be fucking magicians who are obsessed, much like the guy who carries the goldfish. That the whole point that's in the story is to establish that there are kinds of people who would try to do something like this, and it's magicians.
Well, and I'm glad that they had that scene, because that scene is so important too with the other magician. Like
rightfully kept.
So like integral to the book. And then having it here, it's such good shorthand to say, like, this is how committed these people are going forward. What are the mysteries? How committed are these two men as we see them their careers develop?
I also loved the finger injury. Such a smart thing to add to the movie. It helps because, like, when you see the finger injury, I feel like it kind of dispels if you had been starting to think something fishy was going on with these two, right? And like maybe they were, as soon as the finger injury happens, you're like, well, I guess it's the same guy every time because he's always missing those two fingers. And I love that it just gets rolled into part of the commitment and the sacrifice that they're willing to make. That once one of them gets his fingers blown off, they take a fucking chisel and off with the other one's fingers. And I love it set up because she says like, this looks as bloody as it was the first day it happened. Totally. There's some of the amazing things that go into this reveal.
And that technically is kind of a prestige that we get more towards the end of the movie, the fingers.
Sure, I'm just getting excited talking about this. We'll have a lot to talk about throughout.
So moving forward with the plot here, the diary takes Andrzej to America to meet scientist Nikola Tesla, who supposedly built a machine for the transported man trick. Andrzej realizes the diary is fraudulent, but Tesla still manages to create a machine for him. However, instead of teleporting objects, Tesla's machine creates a duplicate of them a short distance away. Tesla is driven from Colorado Springs by agents of his rival Thomas Edison, but he has the machine delivered to Andrzej. He advises Andrzej to destroy it, saying it will bring him nothing but misery. Borden's wife Sarah is driven to suicide by his contradictory personality. Borden reveals to Olivia that only part of him loved Sarah and that he loves her. Disgusted by Borden's inhumanity over his wife's death and the two magicians' feud, Olivia leaves. In London, Andrzej debuts the real transported man using Tesla's machine. Borden witnesses Andrzej fall through a trapdoor and drown in a water tank. Borden is discovered by Cutter and turned over to the police. He is found guilty of murder and sentenced to death.
I do want to touch on a little bit. I think one criticism you could level at this movie is that the women characters are not treated particularly well. They are all very much in service to the plot line of the men in this movie. And in fact, Sarah's story, I understand why it was written the way it was. And her committing suicide does make a measure of sense in the moment where she I think has figured out, is my read of it. She has figured out what's happening and that she has been married to two men. and that they are swapping. I think she knows that because there's the whole moment where Olivia says she wanted to meet me and tell me something, right? But then they didn't meet. So the idea is that knowledge drove her to commit suicide. I just like, maybe it could happen. I kind of would have liked to see her instead take revenge in another way, leave him, do something to endanger this secret. But instead, she ultimately is subsumed by his story and becomes just another thing that he sacrifices, right? Which reduces her to a thing and not a character in her own right, making her own decisions. So that was one that, like, I'm of two minds because, like, I can see why it works the way it does in the story, and I think it is powerful. But as a human character who should have an element of agency to in and of herself, it feels like Sarah is underserved here and ends up just getting fully swallowed by Borden's story.
I mean, and that's totally valid, that because I think it is correct. You look at Anjay's wife as well. She's just killed off early on in the film to motivate a lot of what happens in the plot. We have Sarah here is like she has. I think she gives a good performance.
They become things to sacrifice. Even Olivia, who's this beautiful assistant that, like, they've fallen in love with, she won't stay with him. So look at the thing he's sacrificing once again for his art.
Right.
It's again, it works in the story you're telling, and yet I think it's valid to look at it that way and, raise an eyebrow about it, I think, at the very least.
Yeah. So a few things that I want to touch on are some of the visual things, the cues that are used. I love the ball representing the change in Borden and the hat representing the change in Anjay, or at least representing his character in a lot of ways. Like seeing the like multitude of hats as the first shot in the film. And I have to give credit to Nerdwriter1, who is a channel we've talked about.
Love Nerdwriter1,
yeah.
man. Great channel.
This is a video I saw legitimately 8 years ago. Yeah. And it's stuck with me. Every time I think about The Prestige, I think about this video because it's so well put together. Just shout out to his
video.
Work. Yeah. He talks about how the very first shot of the movie is the hats, and then the title comes up, says The Prestige. There's a dual meaning to that. That is The Prestige. He's showing that's a title of the movie, and it's like, a visually interesting shot, but it's also, that is the prestige being put before us. That's also the pledge in a way of saying, like, here's all this stuff, and then the pledge continues on with Michael Caine's character.
There's a pledge of, like, I'm going to explain why this is important.
And then Michael Caine's character goes and sets up the 3-act structure of a magician's trick. We find out that is actually the end of the movie, where he's telling her the position of the tricks and things like that. So all of that to say, the pledge is being done, the prestige, all these clever things, and then the visual nature of which, like, they approach the story, Nolan approaches the story. Man, the hats being so important, the ball being important. And those are like iconic little things that I think give characters so much more weight. And like that, those are the things that I remember about these characters. And just to have that visual cue come up time and again, it makes for some awesome reveals.
I'm with you, man. And speaking of those reveals, speaking of those moments, just back on the Borden performances going on from Bale here, and how after I think, to me, Borden 2 gets buried. Borden 2, who's in love with Olivia, not Sarah, gets buried. But then after gets buried, Borden 2 is the one who's at dinner and having, like, he's fucking pissed. And he makes a reference to, like, I've got a new trick and it involves being buried or something like that. And, like, I think that's the clear sign that, like, this is the Borden who was in the ground.
Yeah.
And he is not happy. And he's fucking up everything. And it's amazing because Fallon is at the table and can't say anything and is watching this man fuck up his own marriage, right? And he is like, his brother is doing it. He can't say anything because of the commitment. And that's, like, the level of commitment he has. It's one of the things that makes Borden such a cool character. And so, but it's powerful, right? And then, like, again, we see later on they're having this argument, and it's clearly that they're like, this is the stuff that's going to lead her to commit suicide within the turnings of the plot. And we see that it's Borden 1 who is actually in love with her, and he's not in there having the fight. He's out there in the hallway picking up the daughter and taking care of her. Those scenes would just make so much more sense and are so powerful on a repeat viewing. You just can't get that on a first viewing when you don't know that, right? You just can't.
Yeah. And then that
you're just like, who's this Fallon? He seems like a nice guy, I guess, in this moment.
But again, the emotional through line of, like, the powerlessness of being in that scenario and not being, because it's so committed to the trick and so committed to your brother.
So committed.
And not, there's the turmoil that's coming out, and ultimately leads to his wife committing suicide. All he can do is be there to comfort his child, and he can't, because I think anyone else other than Borden would run in the room and be like, "Look, it's
Yeah.
over. Here's the
Yeah.
secret. Let's get. We're not even magicians anymore. Let's just live happy lives." But the sacrifice that's made here is like, it's intense.
It's overcome. It's their entire life, and there is no compromise with it. Angier, after his wife dies, attempting to sort of drown himself by putting his head underwater in the sink. There's like a little short scene early on where he does that. And I thought, that's such an interesting moment because it so much sells that there's an element of a suicidal tendency to Angier throughout. And that sells what's going to happen here at the Prestige so much, and his willingness to do what he does.
So Lord Caldlow, an aristocrat, offers to adopt Borden's soon-to-be orphan daughter, Jess, so she is not sent to the workhouses in exchange for Borden's secrets. However, on meeting Caldlow, Borden realizes this is Angier in disguise come to gloat. When Cutter realizes that Angier is still alive, he is disgusted that Angier allowed Borden to be sentenced, but agrees to help dispose of Tesla's machine. Borden is hanged for Angier's murder. Back at the theater, Angier is shot by a stranger who reveals himself as Borden. How each man performed the transported man is revealed. Alfred Borden was an identity shared by a pair of identical twins off stage. When one was Borden, the other was disguised as Fallon. When Angier had shot off one of the twins' fingers, the other amputated his own fingers to maintain the disguise. The surviving twin loved Sarah, while his brother had loved Olivia. When Angier used Tesla's machine, every performance created a new Angier, while the original drowned in a tank beneath the stage. Angier dies from his gunshot and drops his lantern, setting the theater on fire. Borden picks up Jess at Cutter's workshop. In the burning theater, rows of tanks hold dead Angiers.
I love that it says that because I think that's true. It says the original drowns in the tank and creates a new one. And he says, I always wonder, am I the man in the tank or am I the man on the balcony? You're the man in the tank, and I think he knows that.
Yeah.
Because the evidence is in the movie. When the first time he ever does it, he sets the gun right outside the cage. And we see the flash, and then the guy in the cage grabs the gun and shoots the other guy. So the guy in the cage, at the very least that time, whoever was in the cage is the one who lived through that moment. So if you did want to believe that you were the one who got teleported, then you at least know that you killed the real you in that moment.
Right.
So at the very least, that's when the real Angier dies, if that's true. But I think either that's true and you killed him then, and then now you're just duplicating a duplicate, or you know for a fact that you're the one who's going into the tank. And the only way I think that works is, I'm going to tie it back. I think we've established Angier to an extent blames himself and is sort of like drawn in that dark suicidal way to drowning, to where I think he like partially feels like this is an okay way for him to go out because of what happened to his wife.
Yeah,
and
it's
so
like a ceremony.
And every time he walks into that cage, he has this look on his face that is like he knows he's facing death. He's like, I'm walking to my death, and he's gonna do it 100 times. Is the 100 showings where I don't know how many of them they get into, but like that's the plan. I love that, and I think that works even better. Now, fully granted, you have to buy that Tesla was somehow able to create not just a teleporter, but a duplicator, because it not only teleports and it duplicates, right? There's a whole new, and unlike the book where there's like all this like nuance about like the original that gets left behind is like a hollow shell and it doesn't have a soul, and the soul has been transported to the new one. And like the book is really cool, and it gets into its own things with that. The movie dispenses with all of that, and it says, no. There are two, and they are identical. That's the implication we get. Now, whether or not we know that's true, I don't know. But like that's what we're told to be true. So then it becomes a philosophical question of which one is the real Angier, and does it even matter? Are they both somehow the real one?
Yeah, and I think Christopher Nolan sets up, like you mentioned, enough there to where what I draw from that is he does have these tendencies. He does kind of think that his life ended with his the only thing he was living for was this vengeance against Borden, right?
Yep.
So he has been living
And at
sort of as a
one
ghost
point,
anyway.
he does say that it's more important than his wife.
Yeah.
He does say that.
So then ultimately, like, I think we're led to believe that it's almost like a release for him, possibly, where he's ceremoniously doing exactly what happened to his wife. It's a horrific death too. We see like crazy when he's in that tank, and he drowns, like it's the same as his wife. And that,
well, and
leads
it
us
maybe
to
coming
believe-
from the Cutter lie is what we understand later, where Cutter has convinced him it was going to be some sort of peaceful death, but it's actually not. Yeah.
But all of those things to say, that's definitely, he's died 100 times. Like, that's a copy of a copy of a copy. I don't think that it's meant to be the original in any way. But it is interesting because ultimately going and finding this trick from Tesla was that he didn't want to be the guy that's under the stage, when ultimately he is.
He is every time. Yeah, and it's a philosophical question. You know, if you could duplicate yourself down to every thought, down to every fiber, down to every exact thing about you, if you did that in that moment, which one are you? And if we're talking about continuity of consciousness, then you're the original.
And I think that's the only logical way to look at it. Yeah.
That's the only thing that differs you. Otherwise, you are both.
It is an exact copy of you. It's going to think like you. Everything's going to be the same, but
it knows everything you knew up to the moment you were copied.
Yeah, and then continuity of consciousness wise, I think you die, that other one carries on.
Yeah, we got into this with our transporter, conversation on the fly. I think, if you want more of this kind of talk, we got really into it. I would never teleport anywhere because of this exact problem. That continuity of consciousness to me is something I can't get over. But, people have rightfully brought up, going to sleep, being put under for a surgery. There's all these other times where like your consciousness continuity is disrupted. And yet when you come back on, when you switch back on, we feel like it's still us, right? And we don't feel like we died. So there's a lot of like little nuances to this conversation that's fascinating, that we can't fully get into here, but I love this stuff. But I also love that at the same time, we're getting this whole reveal that is like equally as mind-blowing with the twins. And in fact, maybe more mind-blowing because it's been so meticulously set up throughout the entire movie, and it relies less on like an almost magical thing happening. From the moment where he whispers abracadabra right as he gets hanged, that is such a like fantastic moment of this movie. It's so dark, and yet it says so much, right? Like he has been building up this, and this is just who Borden is to a T, right? Like every one of his last moments has been spent on this trick, and even if he's just like playing on the fucking guard, like he doesn't care. Like he knows that he's going to quote unquote survive this because of this master trick he's been pulling his whole life. And so he's able to do this in this last moment.
Yep.
And he plays it off, even as, this is actually Borden number 2, who was the obsessed one, who was the one who couldn't let it go, and is the one who gets captured and tried, is killed here. And he even says, and I think the key is when he apologizes for Sarah. He apologizes for a lot of things. He apologizes for not being able to let it go. Like these are the moments where we get the reveal of like which one of the Bordens this was, who is actually being put to death.
There is a few interesting things that to note though too, because clearly he cared for the daughter so much, even the one who's been incarcerated.
Oh, absolutely.
Like,
yeah, I think they both did.
That's how they play up the idea that this is the same person throughout the whole thing, because he wants to see the daughter and he's talking to her and all this. It seems like he's still motivated by the daughter, when you would think that would be more so Borden 1, who was seemingly the biological father. But then we get into the territory of this is the end of his trick. Like you're saying, like the abracadabra, this is like, that's the culmination. This is all of it. That's what it's all been for. This is the final reveal. I think you can think maybe Borden will continue to do magic in some capacity, but this trick is done. He's never going to do the transporting man again, and like that's all the stuff that they went through for their whole lives was for basically this. And it's just interesting to think like where the story ends up. Borden 1 he's without his wife. He does seemingly end his magic career and end up with his daughter and can go off and live in some happy capacity. But the sacrifices that were made there were heavy. And that's something he has to live with. And I think that's both. That's kind of the commentary being made here, is right. Like we made the Tesla Edison comparison just to see these two people clash their entire lives. Like the collateral damage that's there becomes like, immeasurable. And then you end up in a scenario where like everything's changed. It can never go back to the way that it was. And what form of happiness can you move forward with? And yeah, really, really heavy ending here.
Yeah, it's heavy. Ultimately, there is like a bit of happiness though, in the sense that this one Borden is reunited with his daughter. Cutter has seen now that he has been duped by Angier and has like turned on him, because the whole time he's been more in Angier's camp, and it's when he realizes that he was used to kill one of the Bordens, that he can't stand it anymore, and he turns on him. Because Angier ultimately becomes the most tragic figure, I think, as he has died 100 times to this, right? Like he has been fully consumed by his jealousy of Borden, and there's a really interesting diversion, I think, from the book here at the end that to me is the most telling line, in the sense of like we're also talking about filmmaking, is when Angier is talking to Borden right after he's been shot, and he's like, you don't know why we do this. He says, you really don't know, we have to show them something truly special. And then he says it was the look on their faces, and like that's the thing that is the reason they've done all of this, according to Angier. I don't know that Borden ever agrees with it, but that to me is a line a director would give, right? Because you always hear about directors going to screenings of their films and just like taking in the audience's reactions. And like, I think that's Nolan saying like, that's why he does the things he does.
Yeah,
It's
that's why he
the
makes the
audience's
sacrifices, that he does. He doesn't see his family, his children as often as he probably would like, because he's so committed to this. I have something interesting to pose to you too, as we're kind of wrapping up here. The technology that Angier was able to get access to, and this I think is showing sort of a cleverness and a difference of philosophy of magic that we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks. Angier effectively gets the technology to create a twin of himself, that he could perform the same trick that Borden is doing if he wanted to, but it has to be better. So he could have just cloned himself, made a deal with himself, said, hey, we're going to do the trick and it's going to be awesome. And it's going to be exactly what Borden has going on. And we can live that lifestyle that they are and just be one person. But instead, that darkness is in him, and that guilt from his wife and all the other things. He chooses to murder himself 100 times.
It's dark, man. And like it's like reality breaking stuff, right? Because the book gets into this a little bit and it has different ways of dealing with it. But the book version of Angier puts a couple of gold coins in his pocket every time, so that he's creating these doubles and these duplicates. But in the book, the prestige materials, which I did like that term made it in there at least once, are already dead. So you don't have this problem of having to kill them. But you are also, duplicating money and stuff like that. And it has other consequences that play out a little bit differently in the book. Like it's clear that it's affecting his health negatively. But yeah, another big change is like in the book, it's more about the process being interrupted mid-process. And that's not what happens in the movie at all. So some major changes here at the end, but I really like the way that Nolan did it. And I think he told a slightly different version of this story. It gets into the teleporter paradox in a way that the book tries to skirt around and not have to deal with, at least in the same way. I really like it, man. And it's such a fascinating movie to think about. And there's so many layers to it.
Yeah, and obviously we like to talk about the book and the film here. So to talk about Priest's reaction to the film.
Oh, yeah.
He described it as an extraordinary and brilliant script, a fascinating adaptation of my novel. He said, quote, I've seen the film 3 times. Only on the 3rd time did I feel able to watch it as a movie. Before I was looking at it and thinking, well, holy shit. I was thinking, God, I like that. And oh, I wish I'd thought of that.
Yeah. That's funny, because I honestly feel the same way. Like, it's not even a movie you have to see twice. It's a movie you kind of have to see 3 times, which sounds so pretentious and, like, crazy to say. But, like, I kind of agree with that, man. I think this might have been my 3rd viewing. And man, it really came to life for me this time. I love that he appreciated it. I think he wrote a great book. And I really enjoyed reading that last week. this movie is also spectacular. So I think it's time to weigh in on whether or not we liked the book or the movie ultimately better. So I'll just lead off, man, and I'll say that I had initially, when I heard we were going to do The Prestige, thought like, well, I'm definitely going to like the movie better. But I never read the book, so I wasn't sure. Read the book, absolutely loved it. I really think that was a fantastic book. But what I didn't expect was how much my estimation of this movie was actually going to go up. And it's hard for it to go up because it was already so high, but it did go up. And so that effect brings me around to saying, like, as far as adaptation goes, this is a fantastic example of one. This is a filmmaker and a writing duo with him and his brother who come in and they take a story that's got so much potential and so much that it's doing fantastically well, and yet they decide to spin it and to change it, and they change it to tell a story that is similar but different, and it's the story they want to tell with a lot of the pieces that Priest like put into play, and that's one of the things that we see in like really, really good adaptations, and that's one that I think is totally on display here. I love to see this in an adaptation, so ultimately I'm going to end up giving it to the film, even as I grant both are really, really good.
I can't think of better hands for your work to be adapted. I can't think of somebody who's going to treat it with more respect. Granted, they did change things, and so like if you're very purist on like what you wrote, but it sounds like he was open to some of the changes and was like, wow, that's very clever, which I think with these level of artists, you would be impressed and interested to see like what their take would be. I really appreciate Priest's story because it had the like horror elements and like the really like dark, like there's some darkness in it that borders like into the supernatural of like the story's asking you like, you know, is this all a magic trick and all this stuff? And then once we get to the end, we're getting like ghostly figures and we're getting, you know, a lot of like really cool stuff. And credit to him for coming up with the idea of like the twins and living the sacrifice, the life that you have to live in order to pull that trick off, and just how much weight that carries. But I have to pick the movie in this case. Like this movie, it moved the material in a way that I felt like made it more emotionally resonant. It explored the characters more. We're getting like some really great performances. We have David Bowie, so it's already like, you know, plus 10% right there more on the score. But I am just really impressed by like, this is like fairly early Nolan. Don't get me wrong, like he's established at this point. He's already done a Batman movie. But to want to make a film that's like this, and clearly he's just gone on to make more and more complex films as time has gone on. He's so fascinated by like the nature of what you can tell in film, and I appreciate it for that, because it's like he tries to tell stories that you can only tell, like he's telling them with a purpose because they're a film, and it's like there's certain things that like the medium tends to excel at, and he takes advantage of those. Man, this film, just meticulous detail, expertly shot. I love the way that they use like natural lighting in a lot of scenarios. The way that like visually, there's visual cues as to like where we are within the story. Once you kind of know what the different layers are. I have to give it to the movie in this case. And yeah, like I said, I'd be hard pressed to say a different Nolan movie over this. So I think that means that this is my favorite Nolan movie.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a high level of excellence. Impossible to pick against it, honestly. If you enjoyed our coverage of The Prestige, please finish the magic trick off by leaving us a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. And if you're on YouTube, let us know in the comments. Throw us a like on the video and make sure to subscribe to our channel. It helps us out a ton and helps us continue to grow. And be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky. Anywhere you can possibly imagine, we probably are. And if we're not, let us know. We might jump on that platform too. Yeah, add Ink to Film on all of those. And we already talked about Patreon earlier, patreon.com/Ink to Film. I will mention one more time. We'd love to have your support on there, and that's where you're going to get all the bonus content and the ability to vote on upcoming projects, which you have until the 26th to get that suggestion in for this upcoming one. And thank you to Mark Vandermeulen for the use of our intro and outro music. All right, that's it for Christopher Nolan and The Prestige. This has been a really fun project. Thank you to everybody who did vote on that mini poll that we put out and chose this. It's been a long time coming. I'm so glad we finally were able to do it, man. I had a lot of fun with this one. Anytime we can immerse ourselves in this kind of story, and especially a film like this, this is why the podcast exists, because we get to talk about stuff like this. So thank you for listening and watching the Ink to Film podcast, and until next time, keep adapting.